Welcome everyone to today's IES webinar. With emerging science, technology and regulation, jobs in the environment sector are never static. This webinar series, A Day in the Life, is going to be sharing stories from environmental professionals about how work has evolved and how it may change in the future. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Jonathan Atkinson, Technical Director at CLAIRE. After 34 years in the Environment Agency, Jonathan has recently moved to work with CLAIRE, an industry-leading organisation dealing with best practice guidance and frameworks for positive materials management on sustainable development sites, enabling land contamination issues to be dealt with comprehensively. He has worked on risk assessment of developed closed landfill sites, landfill engineering and environmental controls enforcement on permitted sites, and a variety of land contamination projects. He was part of a team of groundwater and contaminated land specialists, and he has been a national advisor on a number of specific projects related to soil remediation and waste management, including DALCOP and emerging substances like PFAS. He is a chartered environmentalist and, of course, a member of the Institution of Environmental Sciences. In today's webinar, Jonathan will share his perspective on how work has changed in the land sector, using his career to tell the story of society's evolving understanding of environmental issues. This webinar is part of the fifth theme of our year-long Future of ES23 Horizon Scanning and Foresight project, where we are looking at several key environmental specialisms and asking what the job was like in the past, what it's like now, and how it might look in the future in our fifth theme, the job. Throughout this year, we've been bringing together interdisciplinary perspectives on horizon scanning from across the environment. The work is supporting the sector to manage risk, plan ahead, and work towards a better future for the environment achieved through transformative change. In just over a month, we'll be publishing a vision statement on the future of the environmental sciences to bring all of that work together, so keep an eye out for more information on that soon. Focusing on the matter at hand, for this webinar, there will be the chance for questions at the end of the presentation, so please do submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation, and I'll ask these on your behalf later on. I'll now hand over to Jonathan. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Okay, hello all. Sorry if I sound a bit croaky. I'm recovering from a dose of head cold or flu or whatever it was that I picked up last week. Excuse that, but let's just take us forward on this journey. So it's been quite a long one and it's been an interesting one. So I just sort of identify there on the first slide what has really I'm going to try and focus on, and we'll see how we go. If I can make my slides move. It seems to have frozen on me. FD, I don't know why.
If you, there we go.
No, yeah. But it's all right. Okay, so how did I start? Well, initially I decided I was going to do a degree in environmental sciences. I chose Plymouth Polytechnic. There were only two true environmental science courses in the country at that time, one at University of East Anglia and one at Plymouth Poly. Because of the nature of my learning style, I chose Plymouth because it was a much more hands-on course. It was a smaller course, and the environments around in Devon enabled us to do an awful lot of field trips and practical work out on site. So that was really good. I also managed to incorporate a jaunt to Australia in my second summer on a sponsorship program to work for the Department of Environment and Planning in Sydney, which was enlightening on environmental impact assessments, to say the least. I followed that degree initially at Plymouth Poly with a postgraduate diploma at CILSO, the National College of Agricultural Engineering, as it was at the time. And then beyond that, I went and did VSO in the Philippines for a short period of time. I didn't do my full 2 years, unfortunately, because I ended up with malaria and ended up having to come back early. But aside from that, it was a very interesting perspective, as many of those voluntary service overseas projects can be. And certainly it was great to see another part of the world and to work with dedicated people over there. I struggled to get back into work when I first came back. There was very few environmental science type jobs around in the UK at that time. And I ended up actually going back to work on a voluntary basis at Plymouth Poly in the geography department initially as a technician. Really enjoyed working with the students there and taking them out on field trips and things like that. Out of that, I got a paid opportunity for a year, and then I followed that up with again an internal opportunity, following up with some work from one of my professors from the university, who'd gone on to become professor of forestry over at the University of Lae in Papua New Guinea, and he was back on furlough for a short period of time while I was at Plymouth. as a geography technician, and he sort of said, you know, why don't you come out and we'll do some work together in PNG on soils. So again, I had the opportunity to go and look at a completely different country, which is an extraordinary one, a developing country, and looking at the perspectives of deforestation and soil problems and society problems of people migrating towards the bigger town centres, and the impacts on deforestation and silting of rivers and all sorts of things around Leh itself. So that was a really interesting project to be involved with too for a few months. When I came back, though, I found there was very few jobs in the environmental field. I can remember going to visit people like AIRE, as it was back then. There was like 2 or 3 of them in a backroom office somewhere up in a building in London. And you know, they basically said to me that the jobs aren't out there, the work's not out there for us to employ an environmental scientist full time at this point in time. This was before we had the introduction of environmental impact assessment. It was in its infancy, even in Europe, and in actual fact, we didn't introduce regulations for that until required to by Europe in 1989. So many of my Plymouth peers had followed alternative employment routes, going into teaching or commercial activity. Some had gone into the chemical industry or the oil industry, perhaps. But there was very few who were doing the sort of overarching environmental science, which I was very keen to continue to do. So I sort of hung on in there and battled my way through. And I managed to end up working for the waste disposal department, well, initially geotechnical work in Kent County Council, and then working for the Waste Disposal Authority, and then becoming part of the Waste Regulatory Authority as things changed in the early 90s. There were certainly things to pick up on through the 90s. There were new environmental laws that were coming into being via Europe. We were setting up the environment agencies in the mid-90s, and we ended up with quite a strong, robust regulator with a real talented workforce eager to make a better place. And we were implementing the Waste Framework Directive, the Water Framework Directive, the Habitats Directive, pollution prevention control mechanisms, and so on and so forth. But no overarching soil directive at that time. Unfortunately, a number of countries, including the UK, were blocking that all the requirements that intended. But it's certainly a very exciting time in the 90s as things really sort of picked up, and we had some quite strong regulatory workforces available to do out and about on frontline regulation. It was very much a feeling of optimism, and we were delivering things. But then workforce issues, the supply of skilled graduates with relevant experience, pay competition began to sort of wind down a bit as things changed post 2010. And there was a constraint on the number of people we had in the Environment Agency. There was a sort of barrier to pay development because of the situation that we had in politics and economics at the time. And certainly it became much more difficult to feel like we were creating a better place or even keeping a better place. And I struggled with some of the frustrations going through into the 2020s, certainly. But I was still keen to follow my passion for soils. I've been involved with the definition of waste code of practice since it was initiated back in the early days of Channel Tunnel Rail Link work, and then subsequently through the Environment Agency document definition of waste on greenfield and brownfield sites. Excuse me. But so taking up a post as technical director at Clare in December last year, and being able to really sort of come back and focus on promoting the sustainable use of soils and the promotion of soil resources rather than thinking of them as waste materials, and the soil health aspect. My interest is not just on brownfield sites, it's across the whole piece of soils. And that's why I've been involved with the Society for Environment Soil and Stones project. We've got another meeting on that in Birmingham next week. You'll have seen, hopefully, the 10 principles that we published earlier on this year in the Soil and Stones report that was published last year. But it's very much about that, driving that direction of sustainable use of soils materials and promoting the idea of looking after soils, because they are so essential, not just to brownfield development in managing the risks associated with previous contamination appropriately, but also managing our soil health so that we can make the biodiversity net gains that we're all hoping to be able to meet later on this year, although certain political rollbacks seem to be perhaps putting some of that deadlines in jeopardy at the moment. But certainly the whole idea of looking at soils as a resource and promoting soil health across the whole landscape, across the whole ecological mix that we have, and everybody playing a part in that, whether it's developers or whether it's farming community, or whether it's those of us who are looking into soil production, food production and food security and so on and so forth. All of it comes together in soil. So it's really important that we all play our part in managing that appropriately across the piece. Do we have a soil strategy? Well, as I say, we blocked a soil framework directive in the past, so that was always a bit difficult. We have a hope on the horizon. There is a forthcoming soil strategy in Europe in terms of an EU soils frame. The DEFRA environmental improvement plan made some very clear and positive soil statements in its when it was published back in January at the beginning of this year, and they set some specific target dates for soil to be considered as a resource and for developing things like soil depots. Obviously, across the international scene, there's a huge interest on all things soil, both in terms of the regenerative agriculture approach and trying to avoid deforestation and bring back soil carbon so that it changes the climate, it changes the ability to grow food in areas that are becoming increasingly derelict and damaged. The whole biodiversity net gain and the whole nature loss of nature problems that we have, but also, developing codes of practice for construction and a better understanding of soil as a living entity in many instances. I think I read in one LinkedIn post, it's a living thing, it's not just dirt, so we need to stop killing it. And very much looking at soil as a massive carbon opportunity to as a carbon sink to help us meet some of those carbon net zero aspirations. So real hope for the future in some of the discussions and the forums and the things that are going on out there in terms of soil. But what are the risks? Well, the risks are that we do get it wrong or that we don't pay enough attention to it, and that the impact of poorly managed soils on climate change difficulties and challenges is enormous. So I think people are slowly beginning to change their perception to the importance of soil. Is that too slow at the moment? Maybe we all have a part as chartered environmentalists and members of professional bodies to try and change that within our own sectors. But certainly one of the things that has been flagged up in the recent IES journal is that there is a skills gap developing across a lot of the sort of industrial sectors, but particularly in the land condition side of things. And that's a real challenge to how we encourage people back into the life sciences and the necessary skills that we have, whether that's in laboratory technicians or whether it's in remediation workforces or whether it's in consultancy. We're all facing a similar thing. It's not just the regulators who are struggling to recruit and retain skilled folk who understand some of these issues and have an approach to deal with them in a pragmatic and appropriate way. But I think we also need to look to the future. It's been absolutely brilliant, I think, to see some of the youngsters, people like Greta and others, and the Portugal Six, really standing up for themselves and saying, look, it's our future, you're damaging, you need to actually sort of change the way you're doing things. And I just have an immense admiration for what they've stood up for. But how do we actually upskill future generations to meet the challenges that they will be facing, because we haven't managed to deal with them appropriately over the last 100 years or so? And I think that needs to start in school. And I'm a huge fan of Teach for the Future, which sort of encourages schools to start thinking about changing the curriculum so that they are teaching kids about what the future is likely to be from the environmental setting point of view, teaching them the sort of skills that they might need to deal with that. My oldest stepson was a teacher for a while, and he said, Dad, the world is changing so fast that actually what we're not teaching kids in schools shouldn't be just the same old curriculum. We should be teaching them how to learn and how to research, because those are the skills that will be vital in the future. It is changing so quickly that the sorts of jobs that will be available in 10 or 15 or 20 years time, we don't even know about at the moment. They don't exist. So we can't teach for those. What we need to teach is an inquiring mind, a mind that understands that we live in a global setting, and a mind that understands that we all have a part to play in how that goes forward. And I just so support the fact that we need sort of everybody in whatever context they are, whatever professional body they support, needs to start thinking about what do we need to do to influence what's going on in schools, not just send our kids to school because that's what we have to do, but actually try and influence the changes in the curriculum. Those are being discussed by the Department of Education. Whether we go on the right course is very much a moot point. So we may all have a part to play in the direction of travel, perhaps. But I think that's the same for university courses and BTECs, apprenticeships, whatever we may have available to us to skill people up. You know, IES accredits a lot of courses that are on the right side of the environmental science field, but I think there are fewer of those than there used to be. There's certainly fewer chemistry courses, there's fewer geology courses, and so on and so forth. And that's a slightly scary thing, and it's worth reading the articles that were in the last IES journal, and the one that Rebecca and I helped put together on the sort of availability of skills coming through from the university courses that are available. I think is a salient point. It's a bit scary to many respects. But I do think it's something that's doable, but we all need to act now. Whether we're teaching, preaching, challenging, promoting, championing, helping train and upskill or retrain, we all need to be playing our part as best we possibly can. We need to review the growth models. I think, you know, those of you who know the sort of economists who are on the green side of things have seen that actually what we're talking about is growth models that allow for sustainable development, but also protect the ability for the economy to sustain itself in the future. We cannot carry on overusing our planet the way that we have done under the existing economic growth models that we've had over the past 100 years or so. Clearly, there is no planet B, and if we carry on, our current course is unsustainable. So we do need to change the whole way we look at growth, I think. There are proponents of the right way of doing things, and there are sustainable mechanisms to do that, I think. And the whole green jobs opportunities that are out there, if we do change to a more sustainable approach to the way we live, I think are enormous. But how do we change, and how do we meet those challenges? I think that latest IES journal and the discussions in the megatrends articles that are in it has got pretty much every avenue covered, really. So I'd encourage you to read it if you haven't had availability of it yet. It's now open access, I believe. Ethne can confirm that later, but I think the articles in there really hit home on a number of different issues that we've all got to start managing in a better way if we're going to have a sustainable development for our future generations. I do feel sometimes when I'm talking to youngsters that I have to hold my hand up and say, look, I'm sorry, I failed. I haven't managed to get the messaging across as strongly as I should have done, having been an environmental scientist since I left university in the early to mid 80s. And I just, apologize for that. But we've done our bit as best we can in many instances, but it's not been enough, because we need to take everybody along with us. And I think it's through our professional organizations that we need to be able to do that, and to reach out and widen the net of understanding. Too often the general public have a very parochial view of what's happening. And I think all of us as professionals need to sort of reach out and try and do whatever we can at whatever level, whether it's talking at WI meetings, whether it's going into schools, whether it's being involved with STEM projects at schools and universities, whatever it is, there is the opportunity to do that. Wonderful articles, things on LinkedIn earlier this year, where Rebecca Hearns from Murray Environmental was going into school and talking to 4 and 5-year-olds and finding a real interest and enthusiasm for things soil. And actually quite a surprising understanding of the environmental issues that we are facing. And I think a number of those kids, even at that age, must have been watching snips of David Attenborough and the Planet series and the Wild Isle series and thinking, we've got to all do something. And it's just great to see children engage, but we've got to sort of take them beyond that initial interest in playing in the mud and wondering about insects, and actually sort of promote that into educational opportunities and jobs and skills in the future. So plenty for us all to do, and I think a real challenge for us all as to how we play our part in that. But it's been an exciting journey for me, if not a somewhat disappointing one in some respects over the last 15 to 20 years, as things seem to have taken a bit of a downslide. And I'm hoping that the current situation that we have is not symptomatic of a backing away of our responsibilities. And I hope that the next few years we'll see more hope and more challenge and more sustainable ways of approaching our growth, and that we can actually move things forward. Yeah, so that, I mean, obviously, as I work in an organization now that's all about promoting best practice and good standards in the land condition community and trying to encourage things, I just encourage you all to have a look at what's available on our website and incorporate that into your day-to-day activities. And of course, you know, Claire works, as many organizations do, and the IES is another example, most effectively if it's members, if people join it as members, but also engage then as members proactively. And the IES has been a fantastic example of that over the last few years. I mean, I've been a member since I left university, and that's always been a core part of my professional background, is to be a member of the IES and become a chartered environmentalist as well, and work with the IES and the Society for Environment on the projects and schemes that they've got. I'd encourage all of you to think about being things like council members on your professional bodies. My time in council at the IES was really enjoyable. Hard work on many occasions, but really enjoyable, and I really felt welcomed. And we felt we contributed something to the running of the organisation and its development. And it's been really great to see the IES grow in the way it has over the last 2 or 3 years, particularly. I think we took COVID as a challenge, and everybody in the teams there in the office rose to that challenge. And I think we've done brilliant stuff ever since in doing more and more of these things like these webinars. So I encourage everybody to be as active in your professional organisations as you possibly can be. And before my voice runs out, Ethne, I'll draw it to a close there and take a breath.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was such an interesting overview of your career path and your thoughts as well about the future of the sector. So thank you so much for that. And of course, thank you so much for your kind words about the IES as well. I would echo that. And, you know, if you're interested in getting involved, particularly if you're involved in the land condition sector, we've got our land condition community, and you can always reach out to me to find out more information about that. But I know we've already got some interesting questions coming in, so I'm going to hop right into the Q&A function. A reminder to any of you that you can pop your questions in the Q&A function, and I'm going to read those out on your behalf. But just to kick us off, so obviously, Jonathan, you've had quite an interesting perspective on the land sector because you have a long history working in the public and regulatory side, and now you've gone to work with Claire. And naturally, as you mentioned, you've been quite active in organisations like the IES as well. So in light of that, do you think the various dimensions of the environment sector work well together? And how do you think that they could collaborate better?
Well, I think that's always been the problem, is that the different sectors and even the different specialisms, whether it's been chemistry or geology or whatever, have tended to work in silos. And that's been, unfortunately, the case in government departments and even in regulators, that they've tended to work separately, and sometimes almost against each other. That was one of the great things about the Environment Agency being formed, was that it was bringing together the National Rivers Authority, the Waste Regulation Authorities, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Pollution, and actually combining those. And yes, it took us a few years to gel and meld and work out where we all stood. But I think that the Environment Agency, as a bigger beast and a coordinated thing, is a much better avenue for delivering on environmental gain compared to those 3 predecessor separate authorities. I think we do, you know, and I've always said to people, I'm an environmental scientist. I'm not a hydrogeologist, although obviously I've specialised in part of that as part of my degree. And but I am truly at heart an environmental scientist, because I think we need to look across the whole piece. And I can remember doing a thing when I was at Plymouth University with our ecology professor, you know, talking about, well, what is our ecosystem? And you can look at an ecosystem, for instance, as the pond in the bottom of your garden, or you could look at it as your farm, or you could look at it as England, or as, you know, the British Isles, or as part of Europe, or actually what it really is, the ecosystem that we live in is the world. And whatever you do in your ecosystem has an impact beyond the immediate boundaries. And so we do have to think a little bit more widely, and as environmental scientists. I can remember one of the key stories that I heard about an aid project going really badly wrong was there was a sort of water specialist company that came in and helped in northern Kenya, where I used to live as a child. And they put in new boreholes so that there would be a dedicated constant water supply for the nomads who were working their way through the oasis that were part of northern Kenya. What happened then was absolute environmental devastation, because the water supply drew everybody to that particular point on a regular basis. All the wood and the trees from the surrounding area were cut down very quickly, and the landscape became devastated, and all the nomads' livestock came and chewed up everything that was possibly to be chewed up, and the area actually became worse off. Whereas before it had time to recover every time people moved on when the water supply dried up, because they weren't there the whole time and there wasn't such a large number of people there. So that just shows, if you look in a siloed approach of thinking, that you can actually create environmental damage. And so it's really critical that we do all try and take on board what environmental science is all about. And it's about not thinking in silos. It's about working with other disciplines. It's about finding those crossover points and working with each other to deliver the end game.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. Apologies, my in there, so I just technical difficulties all around today. But that's I think a really important point that you made, and actually links quite well to another question we've got here. So obviously that kind of systems thinking, interdisciplinary approach is so important, as you've just really well articulated. But I think it can be quite difficult for those who are not used to working in that way. So do you have any kind of advice to those who are looking to connect with environmental experts from other disciplines?
Well, I think that the key thing is to look at your own discipline and then think what's around the edges that actually that might interact with, and therefore, do I need to have a little bit of understanding of those other disciplines? So again, a classic example might be that people who are doing drainage design. So you have civil engineers who are specialized in drainage design. In the past, drainage has been about getting water away from things effectively. We know that's actually not the right thing to be doing anymore. They weren't doing a bad job from a design and engineering point of view. They might have been doing a very good job. But actually, the remit behind what drainage systems need to deliver is changed now. Now we need to think about subsystems. We need to think about the soils and infiltration capacity. We need to think about what materials we're putting and moving around sites as we construct them. We need to think about wetland areas, ponds, streams, swales. And that needs some input from ecologists and specialists in landscaping and so on. So it's just try and broaden your immediate horizon by looking at where you might interact in your discipline with immediate adjacent players, as it were. Then find out how they have to do their job, and then think, okay, well, actually, can we work better together to deliver that better outcome? And I think that's the only way. But just be also inquisitive. Don't just sit in your discipline and read all the documents and papers that come out on your discipline. Get excited about ecology. Get excited about birds. Get excited about drainage. Get excited about groundwater protection. Get excited about sewage inflows, etc. They may all seem fairly mundane, but actually you can always find people who will come and talk to you with great enthusiasm about their individual thing. And I think the wonderful thing about regenerative agriculture is people are realizing that actually all of this stuff comes together, and you end up with just wonderful. If people haven't been down to visit the Knepp estate and read the story about the Knepp estate, please do, because that for me just shows one way where people said, look, nightingales will only nest in these types of forests, so we've got to absolutely preserve those. Actually, what they're finding at Knepp is no, they nest in a lot of different things. It's just that we pushed them into forests over the years, so that's where their habitat is. But they will use other habitat if we make more different things available to them. So yeah, read the Knepp story. If you haven't read Isabella Tree's book Wilding, do. And the chapter on soils is one of the best layman's chapters on soils I've ever read in my life. Brilliant book. Please read it.
Thank you so much. That's excellent advice. And now another question that's just come in. So thinking back to your time at the Environment Agency, there's kind of a number of interlinked questions here, so I'll read them out. Can you comment on the challenge to regulators with recruiting and the impact on the ability of regulators to fulfill that role? Can the EA afford to recruit the professionals it needs? Is it the role of regulators that's being watered down? And should we be concerned by recent government policy regarding the environment?
The last bit, I think everybody should be concerned. Yeah, it's rowing back, as I said in my talk, is not the right thing to do at this point in time. Even from a sustainable growth point of view, it puts uncertainty into investment and the development of relevant tools and stuff, whether that's for nutrient neutrality or biodiversity net gain. That doesn't help the piece at all. I don't think it even helps growth. So I don't think rowing back or preventing the development of the necessary environmental controls that are absolutely critical to saving this planet is the right thing to do. That's a personal view, obviously. But in terms of the earlier part of the question, yeah, I mean, sorry, Ethne, remind me what the key component was, because I kind of got hung up on the political thing there a bit.
Of course. So it's can you comment on the challenge to regulators with recruiting?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, the Environment Agency suffers in the same way that every public service has, I think, and you can see this in education, you can see it in nursing, you can see it in the police force, you can see it in a whole range of public services where you've had folk who joined those organisations as a career. That, you know, my intention was never to retire, was never to leave the Environment Agency. I was going to retire from it in a few years' time, feeling like I'd done the best I could as a public servant. The frustration has been is that you end up then with people staying in the job for a long time, becoming very good at what they do, providing really expert oversight and mentoring and all the rest of it, and then retiring. What you've got now is you've got a lot of people who are retiring. But what you haven't had is now people coming through who take that 30, 40-year lifetime approach to that job. You've got people who come in for 2 or 3 years, 4 or 5 years maybe, and then leave. So you haven't got senior staff who've got a long-term experience to be able to mentor and train and shape new staff coming into the business. Part of that issue about people leaving has been about the funding. And the constraints on pay over the last 10 to 15 years. And obviously, you know, I mean, I know colleagues of mine, I mean, I work for a charity, so it's slightly different, but I know colleagues of mine who were, you know, doing permitting on large scale chemical industries, you know, and they were being offered jobs at twice or treble the salary that they were getting in the Environment Agency. You know, when you've got a family to look after, that's a very difficult decision not to make when life's cost of living is getting tight. So you can understand why so many people are leaving the EA and why it's also difficult to recruit. But it's not just the Environment Agency, you know, it is all public services, I think, that have suffered under this. And I think actually industry itself, you know, consultants are finding there are skills gaps, there are difficulties in recruiting and retaining as well. You know, there's a market out there. You see a lot of changes happening at the moment at fairly senior level where people are being poached from one company to another. And you also see a lot of amalgamation in private companies like environmental consultancies. You don't get that in the public service so much. You know, we are still, there's the health service, there's the police service, there's the Environment Agency, etc. Maybe that, you know, there could be some more changes as NRW found. You know, you could join together perhaps some aspects of it, but that's all a big upheaval and it leads to more disenchantment and so on and so forth. So I don't think the timing for that is appropriate right now. But a lot of it has been the low, you know, the holding in the pay growth. It's been the fact people are retired, and then you haven't got the same senior experienced staff to continue training and mentoring. And to be honest with you, as with everything, COVID, you know, smashed a sledgehammer through some of it and has caused all sorts of problems, which are still, you know, we're still feeling the after effects for, both in terms of mental health, but also just in terms of the ability to, that, you know, a cohort of people who didn't have quite the same site experience, training and so on as new regulators to begin to get the picture. I think there are different ways of being able to train and work with regulators, maybe secondments and so on and so forth. But I think it's the nature of public services as we are under the government that we've had for the last 10 to 15 years. and the austerity that we've been through and the cost of living crisis that is caused the problem. But yeah, I do see, and I said at my exit interview, frontline regulation is at risk if things don't change. And that's why I think organizations like Claire and encouraging people to step up on an individual basis, on a company basis, to actually follow best practice, not because you have to, because there's regulations and there's regulators, but because actually it's the right thing to do for the planet. And I think that's where we've got to have a sea change in mindset. It's actually, don't wait for the regulator to come knocking at your door saying you're not doing that quite right, or that's pretty poor performance. No, your company should be stepping that up. And we as professional bodies should be actually saying, hang on, poor practices just should be a thing of the past now. We all need to be working in a sustainable way. I hope that answers the question.
Definitely. Thanks, Jonathan. And a really powerful message there, I think, at the end. So thank you for that. And then just a final two questions. So the first one I'll start off with was that you mentioned, you mentioned skills in your presentation and the importance of upskilling. And of course, you have the article in the recent journal, which I linked in the chat. It is open access now. But just to give a little bit of a flavour of some of the things discussed, what skills do you think are going to be the most important for the future of the environmental workforce, and particularly for the land conditions sector?
I would say environmental science, wouldn't I? Because I think having that broad spectrum of understanding and being able to at least engage with different parts of our environmental skill set, whether it's ecology or whether it's hydrogeology or whether it's geology or whether it's climate science or whatever, I think that's important. And I remember people saying to us, "Oh, you're an environmental scientist. You're basically a sort of jack of all trades, but you don't really know much about anything, do you?" And it's like, no, but I think that's what's been missing. And when you look at some of the environmental impact assessments that are done, you can see that each chapter has been written by very good technical specialists, but there's no linking up of them. They don't create a cohesive whole. You need an environmental scientist to coordinate that drawing together of the overall picture and actually make sure that it works optimally.
Amazing. Thanks, Jonathan. That makes a lot of sense. And then finally, a final question, really appreciate you getting involved today, is another thing that you mentioned in your talk, of course, is the importance of soils. And obviously it's a very important and sometimes quite understated topic. Do you think that there's a way that we can get a better understanding of the importance of soils in the sector, but also throughout the work of all environmental scientists, and perhaps even beyond that? You mentioned the public as well in your talk.
Yeah, I do think that's the case, and it's a bit like groundwater, actually. We fought for years for groundwater because it's out of sight, out of mind. And it's like soil's the same. It's like it's beneath our feet, so we very rarely pay much attention to it. We'll look at the trees and we'll see the birds flying and the butterflies and the bees and all the rest of it. The dirt's just something that we walk on, and nobody pays much attention to it. I think we've got to change that. I mean, there are some wonderful organisations out there. The British Society for Soil Science and Sustainable Soil Alliance, and there's the UK Soils Hub. If you're involved with anything on soils, get engaged with these sorts of organisation, even if it's sort of like slightly outside your thing. You should be understanding more about soils. As I said, read Isabella Tree's book and focus on the chapter on soils. Watch some of the webinars on regenerative agriculture that are kicking around on YouTube. There's some brilliant stuff for teaching kids at school about soil on YouTube. There's so much out there that's available to us. Read the IES journals. I think we did one on brownfield sites and soils and stuff not so long ago, and there's always some really powerful articles in there that will engage, and widen your perspectives a little bit. But again, I would say engage with your professional institutions, engage with things, particularly like Society for Environment, where if there's something on soils, what can you contribute? How can you engage with it? What do you bring to the table? How can you take the messages away and promulgate them through your organizations and the people that you work with, your clients or whatever? We've all got a part to play. But it means that we've got to sort of get off our backsides a little bit and do a bit of research and get a better understanding and then do our bit.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. It's been really interesting to hear about your career path and your thoughts for the future, and also some really kind of inspiring messages as well to take away for everyone listening today. So thank you for that.
And I would just one extra thing is like you encourage your kids, to take a gap year, go and work on VSO or a project overseas, or there's tons of charities that run different things in different parts of the world. Go and find out what the world's like. When my kids complain about, oh, I've got to go to school, it's like there are kids in Africa who are desperate to go to school, who do all sorts of things, walk miles and miles every day to go to school because they see the importance of education. And we just need to get a better international global mindset through our kids and teaching them appropriate skills for the future, but also just changing our mindset about in learning.
Mm. That's so important. Thank you. And thank you to all of our attendees as well for coming today. I hope you found that as interesting and informative as I did. And don't forget to record your attendance at the IES CPD tool if you're a member. This webinar has been recorded. It will be made available on the IES website and YouTube channel. And coming up soon, I just want to let you know about a few other events that may be of interest. So linked to some of the things we talked about today, tomorrow we'll be talking about interdisciplinarity and the importance of this in the sector. We'll have 3 expert speakers talking about that. And then on Friday, we have our next big horizon scanning discussion event, which is focused on the workforce and the future of environmental jobs. So again, please do tune into that. And next week, we'll be back on the topic with land with our next webinar, which is on utilising remote sensing and machine learning AI to support more effective land management. That's on the 3rd of October. So you can register for all of those on our website. So please do, if you're interested in attending any. And please do keep an eye on our website for more information on our future VS23 project as well. For now, thank you once again to Jonathan.
Ethnic, can I just chuck the challenge out there? There's people listening. What about the day in your life? Offer your career as an opportunity for others to hear about and learn some of the lessons you've learned.
Definitely. We would love to have more people kind of go into the spotlight and talk about their careers. One thing we always hear from our members is the importance of showcasing the diversity of careers in the sector. So yes, I would echo that. Thanks, Jonathan. And thank you so much for your webinar today. And thank you to everyone else for attending and taking part. Have a great rest of your day.
My pleasure. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.